technology, social activism, citizen journalism, Megaphone News, with managing editor and co-founder Jean Kassir, nephew of Samir Kassir, for this episode of the Beirut Banyan.
2015, us as organized groups from civil society, youth groups, leftist groups, feminist groups, were much more visible and had a much more prominent role in also steering in a certain way the demonstrations on the ground. Mm-hmm. Today, I'm not going to say we're irrelevant, but we're close to that in the sense that nobody's waiting for anybody to give them any sort of direction. People are simply spontaneously organizing and mobilizing and taking initiatives. The number of initiatives are much more, too much. We can't keep up on that pace, and that in itself makes it feel like something completely different than anything we've experienced.
And when you say initiative, do you mean more like just individuals taking matters into their own hands?
Yeah. I mean, it can be all sorts of things. It can be calling for a demonstration. It could be what we've seen with the people banging on their.
On their pots and pans.
Yeah. Or also stuff that have to do with recycling or with relief and helping protesters on the ground. And in a sense, I mean, I was 12 in 2005, but there's something that reminds me of this vibe back then, like seeing that an entire population is kind of in sync.
Yeah.
And calling for the same thing.
And so in a way, it's both. It's the accountability of 2015. Of course. And it's the unison of March 14, 2005. Mm-hmm. But for you, since you're now part of this movement on an individual scale and on a group scale, for you, what is different about this time around? In other words, your relationship to the demonstrations. How has your role changed?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to my interaction with people who used to disagree with me politically, since I started becoming politically active in 2011 with the EB Secular Club. Back then, like the mere fact of being part of a secular club was a source of mockery and this is not political, right? Yeah. This is outside the sphere of political. This is very cute, rights-based kind of approach to things, and it will not lead anywhere. Mm-hmm. And it just took us, 8 years to get to the point where our narrative is the mainstream narrative.
The narrative meaning a secular calls for
not necessarily, just acknowledging that the entire system is a system that's based on blackmailing, and what it shows as basically what it claims to be really profound sources of division among society is actually simply a tool to maintain itself and reinvent itself. And what brings people together, their citizenship basically, is much stronger than all the fault lines and all the division lines that can exist. And that it's actually possible to do politics outside the monopoly of the sectarian parties. This kind of, roughly speaking, being our narrative, is today the mainstream narrative. Today, I think,
So that's like a citizen responsibility in that sense, that there's an individual assertion that was not there before.
Yeah, but also coming to the conclusion that the system needs to profoundly change. That there is no more room for reform and to accommodate ourselves with these people, and also the fact that the lesser evil theory has completely collapsed. Like it's no longer something that people can really defend and stick to.
And I know that you're in a way engaged yourself on the streets. You're also part of something called Megaphone.
Yeah.
And that has become one of the most visible tools for the younger generation, at least, how they interact with media and how they interact with news. Do you sense that because technology has shifted so much, and you mentioned the secular society, secular club, so that's the last 8 years, we've seen all the tools necessary. They weren't around before. Do you sense that technology is playing a central role in this revolt, in this moment?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's undeniable. I mean, the mere fact that before traditional media had monopoly over discourse and over narratives, and that today we're much more in control of what's being said and how things are being portrayed is a game changer on its own. And I mean, when we started Megaphone in 2017, we were a group of activists, designers, and people from different backgrounds. And the idea was pretty much that there were two main gaps. The first gap had to do with the offering of news that are designed for social media.
Yeah.
And for us, this was one of the main causes why our generation was moving away from local politics and was not really engaging with local politics and feeling alienated by the way local politics is being treated in traditional media. But surprisingly, they were very much interested in following global debates and following international politics. And for us, it's not that local politics was uninteresting or didn't relate to them, because obviously they were living the problem and they were everything in their daily life was political. It was much more about how the media wasn't really adapting to the new rules of the game of social media. So that was one of the main goals of Megaphone.
So the media not adapting, meaning that they weren't literally going to the streets the way you guys do? Is that
No. What I meant was the formats of traditional media in Lebanon are obsolete.
Okay.
So the way either newspapers or TVs have adapted to social media is just rehashing the same formats and throwing them on their social media platform, rather than adapting to the new ways of basically creating media and creating media material.
Yeah.
The other mission of Megaphone has to do also with the editorial line, because our editorial line is beyond كلن يعني كلن. It's of course a very critical look at the entire establishment, but it's also a very kind of proactive way of pushing specific themes and also featuring marginalized groups like refugees, like the LGBT community, like women and others, as part of our media coverage.
So you were touching on, in a way, a blend of politics and social issues and making them resonate, which is what the traditional outlets here, they try to, but they don't succeed.
Of course, and they don't have the same level of freedom that we do, because they're also tied to financial and political interests, which really tie their hands when it comes to talking about social issues or
So from the onset, when you helped create Megaphone, when you actively now are participating, did you know that was what you wanted? That you wanted to distance yourself from any traditional grouping? That you wanted this to be a completely independent journey? Or did that kind of just evolve on its own when you realized there's no other way to do it? This is the only way we can do it.
I mean, we definitely were dreaming of these opportunities, and to play the role that we're playing today, to be honest, we didn't see it coming so fast. We didn't expect it that within the realm of 2-3 years since the creation of Megaphone, we would be in this position, kind of covering on a day-to-day basis. And it's important to remember that this is a volunteers-led project with very, very minimal funding from grants.
Oh, really? So it's really just completely, almost voluntary?
Yeah. It started off as fully volunteer-based, and then we got a few grants to be able to have 2 people as part-timers. And now we're trying to institutionalize it so that it becomes our day-to-day job. So most of the team is working after hours. They have a day job, and then they produce videos in the afternoon until late at night.
I think it's the most accomplished part-time journey possible, because I know now from having spoken to you a bit that all of you have other jobs that are, in a way, they're full-time, and this is an add-on.
Yeah.
So I really am... I a lot of respect.
Thank you.
This podcast takes about 15 hours a day for me. I can't imagine what you guys are going through. But I'm curious about the momentum and technology, especially when it comes to just interacting with our phones. I had a conversation with Naila Twaini about her newspaper, Nahar, and how it's coping. I had a conversation with the managing partner of Urbanista, where we're sitting, and just his bird's eye view of the way people are interacting. And it seems like even the traditional outlets, they have no other tool other than social media, that even they cannot operate outside of social media. Do you credit social media with pretty much the last decade of Middle East havoc and euphoria? Is social media centered to the story, or is it really that we're romanticizing it a bit?
No, I mean, it's not a binary. It's neither this nor that. It's just a tool that was effectively used, but it's also a tool that can be easily co-opted. I mean, it's also one of the main drivers of fake news. But definitely it's something that it's extremely empowering. I mean, for people like us with almost close to zero budget, we managed to create this platform and got some traction, and then we managed to get some funding to be able to sustain it. So it's definitely something that made things much easier, and that is breaking the monopoly of who owns the narrative and who is allowed to frame events. Definitely. But to say that this is the main driver that can explain the Arab uprising and the Arab revolution, I'm a bit skeptical. I'm a bit more classical when it comes to my analysis. Yeah.
I mean, it's almost silly to a point when people, not necessarily Lebanese press, but a bulk of international press, called this the WhatsApp revolt, as if WhatsApp is the driving force behind both the protests and what happened, what resulted in the protests. And that's too much. That's just too. That's sugarcoating the whole story. But within that framework, it does play a role. That WhatsApp is critical to our lives.
It is.
And I maybe you can tell me. I'm assuming WhatsApp is probably the most important app used the last 3 weeks when it comes to organizing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which is a problem due to security issues, but it's still the main tool to basically communicate among activists, but also to share news and to broadcast.
Do you know what WhatsApp? I mean, are they? Is it that their encryption is just penetrated regularly, or when you say
I'm
security?
not an expert on that. I know there's an end-to-end encryption, but I know there's something about those rules and those terms being that could be changed at any time.
Right.
But
because when you say security, you mean that you're not sure whether or not.
I just trust my colleagues who are who are on top of it and who told us that Signal is much more secure. So we all switched to Signal, and it's quite funny to see like all the list of activists joined Signal within the past 3 weeks.
So Signal is taking off because of the revolution. It's
I mean, it's been a while in the past 2-3 years that people are moving to alternative platforms because of security concerns with WhatsApp.
Right.
But now Signal is booming. Yeah.
Okay. Now, since you're 26, I got that right.
Yeah.
You're, in a way, you're kind of a unique. I think that's the age that bridges the youth momentum on the street, and maybe the slightly less energetic late 20s sort of reaching adulthood and really looking at security and economic concerns in a different way. Do you think this revolution, the muscle or the spirit, the passion, is youth driven, or do you think it's really national and that everyone is on board? And what I'm getting at is, from my own superficial judgment, it at times looks like the average age could be 18.
I mean, definitely the youth factor is in my opinion, the main driver. I wouldn't say, I mean, I'm a bit uncomfortable with the generational kind of conversation, although it's undeniable that a big chunk of the older generation is much more attached to kind of the status quo and to stability and to these themes, and they're much more free from these burdens in a sense. So it's much harder to blackmail the young generation and to tell them that if you continue this way, there's a risk of civil war or there's a risk of economic collapse. This is not something that can work with our generation. We've liberated ourselves from these blackmailing tools that have been basically defining our lives since the 90s. I mean, since the 90s, every time we have any kind of emancipatory kind of demands, we're always confronted with these red lines. It's not the right time, and there are priorities. And
if generation is not if generation is not the right way to look at it, is it that the older age groups that we see on the streets, are they still, in your opinion, comfortable with the power sharing structure Lebanon has had for most of its history? I mean, actually, for all of its independent history, but a lot of its Ottoman and French history. Is it that there's an unwillingness to let go of a model that Lebanon has just been stuck with for so long?
I think.
And I'm sorry to interrupt. The younger generation, is it also a benefit that they don't know the failure necessarily? So they were not. Maybe they're too young to have remembered previous attempts, whether it's March 14. Maybe they were too young to really remember the You Stink movement either. Because if you're 18 now on the street, not only do you not remember the Civil War, you don't remember previous attempts. So maybe cynicism is not there.
I mean, concerning the older generation, I would say that in 2015, definitely my generation of my parents and my grandmother were much more kind of cautious. They were excited about what we were doing as of 2015 and then 2016, Beirut Banyan, and then later on, but they weren't fully on board. Today, the conversation I had with my grandmother were extremely emotional. She was like, "You're actually right."
And that's interesting.
She's 86.
Yes.
And we always used to fight about me being completely not caring about these red line and this consideration of security and demography and so on. And she was much more attached to them for like a reason that can be understood. And today the conversation we're having, she's even more radical than me in the sense. She's saying like me, the bottom line of what my parents and my grandmother are saying is that this is something that we were dreaming of. We never have the guts to go that far. We were also being blackmailed by the experience that we lived by the risk of the civil war, the risk of an economic collapse, because this is so vivid in our memory that any time we were hoping for something more ambitious than mere reforms, there was something that was holding us back. So today I don't want to be too optimistic, but I think that this generation is also starting to shift, the older generation. And when it comes to the newer generation, it's not that they're cynical or they're oblivious or they're not aware of their history. It's just that, this has been the main framework that has prevented them from being political since they were born. Anytime we were trying to express or articulate political demands that have to do with our rights, that have to do with ranging from women's rights to freedom of expression to other issues, we were always confronted with this narrative that this is not the right time and this is not something that can be possible, and there is like specific rules of the game in Lebanon that you need to respect.
It's for me, it's so unusual where the older generation is encouraging the younger generation to protest. Because usually there's a lot of skepticism. Don't risk your life. Don't do something stupid. Politics is not for us. It's dirty. It's crooked. This time around, it almost seemed. And your grandmother's a perfect example. She's embracing and encouraging and wanting. So, I want to ask you just the trajectory of what's happening now. It's now the fourth week of the protests. And the Prime Minister resigned 3 weeks ago, or maybe even a little more. From I don't want to be too hard on anyone here, whether it's the protesters or the people wanting change. But do you think that because it's taking time, that this may just naturally die down? And I ask you not in terms of whether or not people want it to die down, but the simple fact is that the Lebanese economy is frozen. People are not protesting nearly as much as they were 2 weeks ago. Do you think this may actually just naturally fizzle out so long as the upper echelons don't move? They don't, because we're waiting.
It's very hard to speculate, but my conviction is that this energy will not disappear anytime soon. There is something that can be undone, and basically, irrespective of the other factor that could be on the table, like an economic collapse or other stuff, we've seen that people have the capacity to reinvent themselves and reinvent the way they protest. So it's true that in the past 2 weeks, maybe demonstrations were less less numerous than the weeks before, but we've seen other forms of protest. We've seen other forms of protest that are extremely also creative and that are also very powerful that happened. And then the switch from blocking roads to basically protesting in front of state institutions and in front of banks. And this is something that shows that people have the ability to adapt. And at the right time, I'm pretty sure that the same number of people will demonstrate in the street. And it's totally fine for this to be...
You see that there is a chance for it to up
of course.
The numbers to come back.
We've seen it anyway. We've seen that there was a week where demonstrations were a bit more quiet, and then on a Sunday, after the demonstration of our own supporters in Babda, we've seen a huge number of people demonstrating in Martyr Squares on Sunday. So it fluctuates, and it's totally normal. And let's also remember that we're talking about unorganized groups. We're not talking about political parties who have their techniques to sustain momentum on the ground and to also make sure that their people are not very tired and are not drained. It's just citizens that have been on the streets for 4 weeks without any kind of structured support. So it's totally normal for this to fluctuate. But I'm not afraid that it will disappear anytime soon. And of course, the risk of the economic collapse is a big risk. And basically next week we're going to see how things will unfold.
Because the banks have only opened, I think, for 1 full day since the uprising began. So there's, couldn't that scare away enough people to just kind of wanting to come back to a comfort zone that they're used to? I'm not trying to discredit the momentum, but just talking about just natural time does play a role, I think, and
It's important to remember that a huge number of people have literally nothing to lose.
right.
I'm not one of them,
Right,
Right?
yeah.
I'm from the middle class. I
Yeah.
have some privileges,
Yeah.
but there are a huge number of people that have nothing to lose, and this is something that, in my opinion, is also a guarantee that these people will fight till the end, and all of us will fight till the end. I'm not trying to kind of distinguish between different
Sure,
protesters, but there's something that is so profound that was broken in a sense, and that.
So in a way, because the country is so broke, it allows for more time to maneuver. That people don't have enough people literally have nothing to lose.
Yeah.
Therefore, they're going to put all their energy into something like this.
Yeah.
It's an odd situation where Lebanon is so broke that's the passion goes not to. I mean, in a way, it's not to the economy; it's to politics, and that's a very special moment where citizenry is more important than quick earnings.
I mean, I wouldn't say it this way because I'm pretty sure that next week the battle will be about who will pay the price of the collapse, right? Because
Right,
when we talk
right.
about capital control, about exceptional measures of the banks,
Yes.
we want to make sure that the ones paying are not like the majority of the people that have kept their savings, right? So we're talking about big capital, people who have big amounts of money and who are trying from today to transfer their money to banks abroad, and they're unfortunately allowed to do so because of how the system works in Lebanon.
But this could go either way. It could cause more people to go to the street. It could also scare people away. So in other words, it's not really clear how the economy will either impact, or it'll either increase the momentum or perhaps frighten people. It's just too early to tell.
I mean, I agree. There's a lot of unknown variables, so
Yeah.
it's pretty hard to predict. But when it comes to the people's kind of sentiment or attitude towards the establishment, and also their eagerness to get rid of this establishment, I don't think that an economic collapse will make them like divert them from this goal.
Right.
It might affect their ability to mobilize on the ground, and it might shift their priority for a short period of time because they will be kind of seeking more urgent things in their life.
Yeah.
But when it comes to their political attitudes and their eagerness to seek change, I don't think that's something that's going to impact them.
And you touched on something earlier, which is that this is leaderless up to a point, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there are people involved.
Of course.
And sometimes they're not necessarily the most visible, but there are groupings, there are actors on the street that we see, and they're very smartly not putting their face in the front of the movement or not trying. A few people did kind of flirt with it, and they kind of fizzled away.
Yeah.
So in a way, they're being filtered out. But I want to take us back to almost 15 years ago, which is February, March 2005.
Yeah.
A man I deeply admire, and your uncle, Samir Asir. He wasn't a leader per se, but he was a voice, and he was a serious voice, an eloquent voice, a journalist that became, in a sense, a politician, a historian, a man with a lot of decency and dignity and foresight. I remember being persuaded to keep going back to the street because of him. And I love the quote that he left us with, عودوا للشارع أيها الرفاق تعودوا
إلى الوضوح.
إلى الوضوح. Now that quote meant something, I mean it still means something today obviously, but it meant something then because that was the first time since the end of the Civil War that people had a rallying call.
Yeah.
And then of course we have Gibran Twaini doing something similar, that this ode to Lebanon that he gave us and we still use in Martyrs Square. There were names that we could turn to. There were also politicians that got involved, and maybe they got too involved. But these two names I associate with a lot of purpose to keep going and trying.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you, now that we're seeing this younger generation without the leadership, do you think that people like those people, whether they're journalists, they could be like you, or they could be just people with a voice, academic background that need to express their thoughts and unify people, do you think that we'll need these voices at some point to help steer this to a political cause?
I mean, I would say that these voices exist. It's just that they're not maybe as visible and as prominent as they used to be in 2005. We have many leaders, we have many faces, and there are a lot of people. It's just that we have maybe redefined the concept of a leader and the archetype of who can be a leader. And I'm not trying to romanticize the fact that it's leaders or it's organic, and I am convinced that we need political institutions and we need to mobilize within the frameworks of syndicates and parties and unions, and we need spokespeople and we need charismatic people that are able to come in to sustain momentum and so on and so forth. It's just that in the early days, what made it also so impactful was that it was subversive, it didn't have a face, it didn't have kind of a political party. The establishment was totally surprised by how things were unfolding.
Yeah.
They couldn't expect what was the next move.
Yeah.
And this is what caused the panic, in my opinion, among the establishment, and that also allowed us to get our first victory, which is the resignation of the government. So maybe we could separate. In this phase, it was definitely the right tactic and the right approach, not to steer things in a kind of a classical way with very clear political institutions that are getting together in a coalition and then issuing statements and trying to steer things. But beyond this tactical point, I think that, today, to sustain this, it is undeniable that we will need to organize, and it has already started. You have alternative syndicates that are organizing amongst journalists and university professors, and also other fields, مهنيات ومهنيين, which is one of the few organizations that are emerged from this revolution.
What is the evolution from there? Is it simply a new political party?
No, it's not a party. It's just people who are trying to mobilize around interest-based and class-based issues, and just getting organized to be able to sustain their action on the street and to be able to strategize and to be able to plan next steps. And it's undeniable that from these collectives, there will be leaders that will emerge. But again, it's very important to remember that I think that this generation has also redefined a bit what leadership means.
That's an interesting point. I've never heard anyone express it this way. So the leadership in itself has changed.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And I would say also the leadership in its kind of patriarchal also and macho way is something that is not necessarily accepted today by a big chunk of the population. And
it's unthinkable to go to Nahad now and just like, it's crazy, right? The national anthem with that giant woman in the middle in red.
Yeah.
So that's special. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, the role of women, besides their role off the ground, there's also a big role politically. It's basically to impose issues that have to do with women's rights in the forefront of politics, and refusing that these are marginal or these come as a second priority and as a lesser priority. What feminists have achieved in this revolution is totally unprecedented and something completely admirable.
Yeah.
And also the values that come with this feminist movement have to do with the way we approach leadership and who has monopoly over speech and who has monopoly over the mic and over media appearance. So to answer your question shortly, yes, we will definitely need people, we will definitely need inspirational figures, but the way these people will emerge, in my opinion, will be much more grassroots. They'll be much more rooted in collectives that are getting together, and they will be much more plural and diverse.
More like a symbolic form of leadership is now more critical than names. I mean, in other words, like women's rights is now a type of leadership.
In a sense, but also names and also people who have credibility and who have credentials. I mean, I think we need a bit of everything. We need to maintain this extremely organic and subversive and spontaneous form of action, but we also need to organize into collectives.
That's interesting. Subversive and spontaneous.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is what didn't happen before. That you didn't have those two components together at the same time.
Befor, you mean in 2015?
Well, more like 2005. And it was a sort of a 15-year build-up to an incident that led people to the streets. And 2015 was really the same thing. It's 25 years of trash and corruption and horrible governance. But subversive, which is, I think, somewhat new, I don't remember seeing that before. This creative way of, I mean, this type of revolt is so unusual, and you have kids chanting curse words, and it becomes almost like the national anthem. That's, I mean, you're literally insulting the foreign ministry who made him into a complete joke overnight.
Yeah.
That was unthinkable before.
I mean, I can't compare with 2005 because I didn't live the experience. So everything I know about it is from stuff that I read. But maybe something that could be interesting would be to see in 2005 political parties that have been entrenched in Lebanese politics for years were also central to what happened. Of course, there was a spontaneous component, and you had a very big citizen kind of non-sectarian movement within the independence intifada.
Yeah.
But you also had political parties that were really trying to steer things in a very strict way. In 2015, we didn't have political parties, but we as collectives also I think made a mistake in trying to organize too much things on the ground and to be too much obsessed with these coalition and these endless meetings that just take ages and don't get any results on the ground.
You said it. I mean, these are...
And then today we've seen that like people have completely took control over the pace of things, and it's just about us trying to support and to help as much as we can in the backstage sustain this and not put ourselves in any way in the front. And this is what allows for creativity and subversion, because nobody's telling anybody don't do that or do this. People feel completely owning the moment and being able to self-express the way they see fit.
And just in the short term, do you see this movement better suited for municipal elections, or do you see something like this needing to enter the political framework straight to parliament?
I think that there's definitely an opportunity to go straight to parliament.
Straight to parliament.
Yeah. Okay. Because we've also redefined what politics means. Politics is not only about sorting garbage.
But there's no strategic value to going to an entity that is not necessarily fully controlled by the old political guard.
I mean,
and I don't mean it in terms of not going to parliament, but I mean that because that is a level that is really, I think, underappreciated.
Yeah.
That maybe a buffer could be created from that end.
I mean, I was part of Beirut Banyan, so I'm completely convinced in the importance of working at the local level and redefining politics from a local level, and also how much. I mean, basically, local politics is a much more direct form of democracy, and people have much more impact in the decisions and much more involved in. But at the same time, I think
naturally links to what people want on the streets as well.
Absolutely,
which is simply good governance.
But also making the jump and entering politics at the national level is also something that is unavoidable. The criticism that I could make, which is the one that I made personally in 2018, I wasn't convinced with the alternative that was presented basically by the so-called civil society, because the approach to legislative election was in a sense the same that they had or that we had to municipal election, in the sense that we're not tackling the divisive issues, we're not tackling the issue of Hezbollah's weapons, we're not having a very clear stance on economic issues, we're not really, maybe we're shying away from saying that we want a secular state, upholding refugee rights. It was a very toned down version of what we stood for the past 8 years. And for me, this doesn't work. It doesn't help gather more people. On the contrary, it makes you seem weak and unclear, and not really having a very clear and strong project. So I think that the entry point to national politics is really to have a very clear discourse and not to avoid any issue that we think is divisive or is,
But a big issue like weapons beyond state control, right? And just the fact that we still have a giant state within the state. Is that something that you think this movement will address head on? Or do you think, because we both know that other people have tried to address that concern, they've either been exiled or eliminated?
Of course.
So do you think that within this movement, that huge issue that has been largely left out of the discussion, largely, do you think that can be addressed as well?
I think there is no taboo in 2019. Everything can be addressed. Including Hezbollah and including.
I like that optimism. Yeah.
I mean, it's more than optimism. I mean, we're seeing it. We're seeing it happen, right? Like people.
I like that clarity.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm too old.
What I could say about Hezbollah is that definitely the approach that is coming from a sectarian mentality is completely useless, and this is not something that can hinder Hezbollah in any way. Criticizing Hezbollah from a national and from a civic and from a secular perspective is, in my opinion, what really Hezbollah is scared of. And we could give many examples about the relationship between Hezbollah and a leftist national alternative. I mean,
Yeah.
I think you got my point. From
Yeah.
82 till 2005. And again, today, there is no legitimacy, in my opinion, to a movement that wants to criticize Hezbollah and the weapons of Hezbollah without this movement being inherently secular and not coming from a sectarian perspective.
Right.
Not being a
Right.
Sunni and Christian movement
Right.
against a Shia majority with
Yeah.
weapons.
Yeah.
Because if this is how things will go, we're back to the spiral of sectarianism and demography and power dynamics.
So it's better that the argument is done through the secular framework in order for it to literally gain traction and credence.
That's the only way to make it credible first,
Yeah,
and that's
yeah.
also the only way to make it powerful and threatening. Because
Yeah.
when we're all from all sects and from all regions saying that we're against the entire establishment and we want the Lebanese state to protect us, including from Israel and first and foremost from Israel, and we want this to be clear and set in stone. This is much stronger than having a bunch of sectarian parties who've dealt with the civil war, who have a long past, and who have a very narrow sectarian consideration,
Yeah.
criticize Hezbollah from this standpoint.
Right. Aside from images of Tripoli and Nablus and the whole country in unison, which I think a lot of people will remember years from now, personally, I was very happy when I saw Martyrs Square come to life.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be very personal here, where the tombs next to Hariris, my father is buried there. I was so happy to see people there. I've been going there for so long and it's been deserted. Usually, I'm the only person there. Looking around, there's just no one but me. Cold silence. It almost feels like a loss that it's over. This was a failed attempt at fixing the country. The last few weeks, people using that space, people joyous, people holding the flag with pride.
Yeah.
I end the tour at Samir Asir Garden, and I like to bring him to life whenever I can. And I wanted to ask you, do you think Samir Asir would be happy with the way we're conducting ourselves today? Is he smiling from above, knowing that not just his relatives, but his friends and his comrades, whether it's Ziad Majid, who made an occasion by coming back, or
Absolutely.
do you think that they are proud of what we're doing?
I mean, when I see Lias Khoura and Ziad Majid and their optimism, and also what Lias wrote about Samir,
Yeah.
I think that's the answer. And my relationship with my uncle is that of a nephew and an uncle. I of course look up to him as a figure and as a model, but I've discovered him politically, unfortunately, in like his last few days and after his assassination.
Yeah.
And this is when I started to discover his real role. Before that, he was my uncle.
Yeah.
We were pretty close, So, but of course, I mean, for me, what Samir stood for in 2005 is something that we are doing today, and we are repeating.
So we are literally using that quote to our advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to speculate, but I'm pretty sure that he wasn't very happy with how the independence intifada ended and how events basically followed. And there's an article that talks about that, which is Intifada fil Intifada. So in my opinion, I mean, what we're doing is completing the kind of the Bayan al-Hilm in a sense, which is to see finally a free, democratic, secular state that has social justice where people are enjoying their rights. And that's definitely a legacy that we're continuing today.
On that note, it's a privilege to meet you. I know it's the first time we meet. I'm glad this is our first conversation. We can talk about more mundane things the next time we see each other. So thank you.
Thank you.
Daily episodes as the uprising continues. To stay updated, simply subscribe to your preferred podcast platform or find us on our YouTube channel. And kindly consider a contribution through Patreon. There's a link in the details box below. Until next time, I'm Rani Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.